Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Holland Night's overview on community project funding. I'm Rich Gold, your host for this afternoon, and I'll be doing intros of each of our panels and handling questions along the way. But first, doing a general overview of community project funding and the new rules of the road. I'm coming to you today from the Holland Night Appropriations Mobile Command Center on the New Jersey Turnpike. Okay, guys, that was a joke. You can laugh now. As you see, we've got a good group of speakers for you today with decades or hundreds of years of experience of earmark funding, as it used to be known. Just to do our brief overview, before 2010, earmarks were a very significant part of the appropriations process. Because of some fraud, waste, and abuse in the early 2000s, the Republican conference in the House decided to create a change in policy and not include earmarks in projects in bills going forward. And that's been the way we've operated for the last 11 years, with project funding basically being done through the executive branch through grant programs like the BUILD program in transportation, and COPS program in justice, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, that's all about to change back again. Members of Congress believe that over the last decade, they've seen their authority over the congressional power of the purse erode, the responsiveness of federal agencies through oversight also erode, and frankly, a lot of the grants that were handed out, even if it were in their districts, might not have been priorities for the members of Congress or the senators in terms of where the money ended up getting spent by executive branch grant programs. So community project funding can most easily be defined as a specified dollar amount going to a specific recipient located in a particular geographic area. And eligible projects range from infrastructure, community programs, university research, hospitals, and other local initiatives. One thing we should be clear about, we're not going back to the bad old days. Earmarks are limited. Only 1% of total appropriated funding at a max will go to community projects. At the height of earmarks before 2010, that number had creeped up to 2 or 2.5%. Members will be allowed to, in the House of Representatives, request projects, a total of 10 projects across all the spending bills. And the leadership has made clear they only may get, a couple of those funded at the end of the day. So again, it's not going to be quite as ubiquitous by any means as it was before 2010. The guidance that is out so far from the House is pretty clear. As I mentioned, the 1% cap and the limit on the number of requests. Also, there's a limit on for-profit recipients. So we won't be seeing, at least in the House so far, private sector entities getting funding. Project descriptions will be limited, and input on the Appropriations Committee website will be disclosed in appropriations reports with the member's name next to the project if it is funded, so that there'll be significant transparency. Also, members of Congress themselves must certify that they have no financial interest in any project that they submit. There's also a requirement for community support. So what has been the practice for years in making sure that you've got local government support, perhaps state legislative support, local chamber of commerce support, will now be required with submission of the projects. And community projects will be audited as well on the back end by the Government Accountability Office to make sure that funding is spent for what it was requested for. Eligible accounts and programs, as you can see, of the 12 appropriations bills, there are 2 of those bills that do not have community project funding. Obviously, the State Foreign Operations Bill, which funds overseas accounts at the State Department, et cetera, will not have community project funding because it doesn't fund domestic activities. And the legislative branch bill also will not have community project funding because it funds only the capital activities. But everything else does have required accounts, and we'll go through those on a one-by-one basis as we move through the program today. Tips to focus on as you are thinking about community project funding. First of all, although this isn't an option this year, normally we encourage our clients to get started as soon as possible, typically in the third or fourth quarter before the year you're going to request the funding. So normally we start planning for earmarks or community project funding in September or October, and then visit with delegations in January or February, and requests themselves will go in typically in late February or early March. Second, consider outside expert support. Yes, this is my self-serving advertisement for the day, but it is also the fact that earmarks are not easy. In some ways, they are as or more difficult than traditional grant programs like the program. There are politics that come into play. There are lots of places in the process where things can go wrong, and you need to both details of each of the programs, the staff on the appropriations committee, and the delegations you're working with. So it is not the same as just submitting a piece of paper in the traditional grant process. Reach out to your congressional delegation early, keep them in the loop, let them know what your priorities are, and let them know the support that you have. It is very important for members of Congress to understand, in order to make your request, why they should support it and how much of a priority it should be. So always make sure that you're staying in regular contact with your delegation. Obviously, that's something we do for our clients when they're requesting funding. Plan your message. This is not just a dry paper writing exercise. You need to be able to communicate to your members of your congressional delegation why this project matters, how it's going to make a difference at the local level, and why it's deserving of very rare federal funding. So in particular, it's important to make clear how the community writ large is going to benefit from the project, how it's going to make a difference in their constituents' lives, and how, if they get asked about it at a press conference or in a TV interview, they're going to be able to not only justify, but make clear that this project is critically important to their congressional district. Also, really important to observe how your legislators work together on projects. Projects that have broad support, perhaps beyond a single congressional district, that are regional in nature and cut across a number of districts, are going to be particularly attractive. How do your members of Congress in adjacent districts get along? Do they work together well on other issues? Can this project basically bring them together and help them work together? How do they work with the Senate delegation? All of these things must be considered in choosing among potential community projects, not only for what you submit, but for what the delegation is likely to fund. That concludes opening remarks. Thank you.
Leslie, you're on mute.
We're going to be doing a discussion about the transportation, housing, and urban development accounts. Next slide, please. I'm Leslie Polner, and prior to joining Holland and Knight, I served as a chief of staff in a congressional office, really during the ending era of earmarks until 2010. Mike?
My name is Mike Freeberg. I'm a partner at Holland and Knight, and during the earmark stage, I was a professional staff member on the Committee of Appropriations on the subcommittee of Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development. So good combination for Leslie being her personal office and me committee staff.
So before Mike and I talk about the accounts, we thought actually, given our unique perspectives, that we would talk a little bit about the lens within which we each looked at community project funding, then known as earmarks, and kind of how we selected projects. So Mike, do you want to talk about the committee perspective first?
Sure. Once you go through the personal office, the committee staff kind of looks at it as a review. So you get a bunch of projects, and our goal is to make sure that it's the best use of taxpayer dollars, where I would say personal office, they care about more of the constituency. We're trying not to basically look like idiots. There was a list that we always said we do not want to be on. It was called the Flake list. It was after Congressman and Senator Jeff Flake. And it was a list of basically the bridges to nowhere that you've heard of, and that fraud, waste, and abuse, or just projects that don't look good optically. So when you're doing these projects, you have to look at that lens, because the committee staff were the ones that said no to the personal staff that said, hey, this is a great project. We're like, well, if it has the chairman's name on it, we're not doing it. So with that lens, you really have to look at what are the eligible requirements. Leslie?
And so from the personal office perspective, of course, it's especially important, as Rich earlier mentioned, we're talking about very limited dollars. We're being told that members are going to get roughly between 1 to 3 of their requests fulfilled. And so from that personal office lens, the member wants to be able to show that they've delivered something for their district. And so, you should be thinking about opportunities where the member might get some press. You should, that community support piece is really important because it enables members of Congress to take care of multiple interested parties in their district at once. And then, you want to be looking at, potential projects that really align with the member of Congress's agenda and priorities. You want this to be really attractive to them. As we're going through this process, I've sort of been thinking about as if you're dealing with 435 mini foundations, each with their own sort of unique lens and filter for these opportunities. So Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about the account?
Yeah, so I'll go over the transportation accounts, and Leslie will go over the HUD account. So local transportation priorities. The eligibility is Title 23, which is highways, expanding a road, expanding a bridge on a road, and then Title 49, which is transit, capital investment grant type of things. The specific one is you want capital projects or project-specific planning. So something that's tangible, something that does not have a cliff, a discrete project. So no administrative and no operating expenses. So that's kind of an important thing. What kind of gets confusing is, the second criteria is supported by the state and local administration, including in a statewide transportation improvement plan, a STIP, or a transportation improvement plan, a TIP, which you've probably heard of. That would satisfy this requirement, but it's not exclusive. You don't have to be on a STIP or a TIP. It does help a lot, but if you're not going to be on a STIP or a TIP, it better be on something like a STIP or a TIP. So it has to have a regular planning. It can't be just willy-nilly a constituent-based project that just came up out of thin air. Why is that the case? The committee is going to look at this to make sure that there's no, it is not just based on political whims, and it's on a planning process. Again, no bridge to nowhere, no get flaked where you're going to get a front page of the Washington Post of how this is fraud, waste, or abuse. The last is it has to be administered by public entities. So think of your local transportation authority or local community entity. Then you have another, the only other transportation is AIP, Airport Improvement Program. And that's basically helping airports. It has to comply with the AIP. It's very discrete projects and specific eligibility. And so just think if you're going to apply for an AIP program at the DOT and FAA, this is how the eligibility would work. Leslie, why don't you go on EDI?
Great. Well, so the HUD Economic Development Initiative, or HUD EDI account, is really one of the more flexible accounts, and it's one of those accounts that you can actually use to do construction. So you're able to use this for site acquisition, demolition, or rehab of housing or facilities, construction and capital improvements of public facilities. Public service is also eligible. and really can be used for a broad range of economic and community development activities. The key here is that they have to be consistent with what is eligible under a CDBG, or the Community Development Block Grant, and it needs to be new activities. We've been told, this account is very, very competitive, and we've been told to keep requests under $1 million. And, if past is prologue, even just looking, for example, at what was funded in 2010, when, the last time we really had earmarks, and it was everything from, purchasing land and doing construction for a homeless shelter, to streetscaping projects, to installation of solar panels for a food bank. And so really covering the full range of activities and types of facilities. But again, very, very competitive because it is so flexible. And that's going to end our portion on transportation, housing, and urban development.
Thank you.
So good day, I'm Robert Bradner. I'm a partner at Holland and Knight. Prior to being here at Holland and Knight, I spent a fair number of years up on Capitol Hill, including for the last 5 years working for the chairman of the Labor, Health, Education Appropriations Subcommittee. And that was during a period of time when the practice of earmarking widely expanded. And then, of course, continued to do that sort of thing at Holland and Knight until the programs were discontinued about a decade ago. And I'm joined with Shauna Watley, who I'm going to ask to introduce herself.
Thank you, Rob. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I'm Shauna Watley. I'm a senior policy advisor at Holland and Knight. I've been with the firm for 14 years, but prior to joining the firm, many moons ago, I worked for Senator Bob Kerrey from Nebraska, and he served on the Appropriations Committee. I served as a part of his appropriations staff when I worked in the Senate, and so I'm very familiar with the process, and so look forward to speaking with you today. Rob?
So I'll talk a little bit about the accounts in the Labor and Health and Human Services Department that have been opened up for community projects, and then turn it over to Shauna to cover the Department of Education. In the Department of Labor, there's just one. It's the Employment and Training Administration. And these are the people who administer what's known as the Workforce Improvement Act. It used to be known as the Job Training Partnership Act. And these are going to be projects for service delivery. They are not for bricks and mortar. You can have a little bit of incidental equipment or curriculum development, but what they really want to see is an active program that's going to train people and get them to work. And that's the emphasis, and that's what's going to be attractive to members and to the committee. If you're familiar at all with the Workforce Improvement Act, it works through a series of local workforce boards. It is not a requirement that these funds go through those boards, but obviously if you have relationships with those boards, participate in their activities, that's going to make your project look a little more attractive. The Department of Health and Human Services is doing a couple of things. One is the Health Resources and Services Administration. And as its name suggests, this is not really much of a research agency within the public health service. It's a program delivery. This is the administration that funds things like community health centers, Ryan White program, so forth. And the big historic emphasis here was on health facilities. And this is really the opposite of what I just said. This is for bricks and mortar, construction and or equipment. And if you're going in that direction, that could be, that could be a build out of a community health center, equipping dental chairs, expanding facilities to serve behavioral health, any sort of, it could be a biomedical research facility. So that, the health facility definition is pretty broad. You can't use this money to buy land or buy buildings. You can't use it for retroactive costs. And if you're going to go in this direction, keep in mind that when the federal government gives you money, they take an interest in the real property that or equipment that they've given you. So you have to have the ability to, if you're on leased land, you have to have the ability to extend that lease for at least 25 years. You can't resell equipment, so on and so forth. They are allowing some non-construction activities under HRSA, and that would include activities related to health professions, education, and workforce development. So, there's a number of things that are attractive in that area: nursing, community health workers, that sort of thing. And then a couple smaller pieces. One is rural health outreach, and they do actually, in this case, allow research to be funded. And then there's an emphasis on telehealth initiatives. Telehealth has been huge during the pandemic, obviously. And so the acquisition of information technology to facilitate that is a point of emphasis as well. If we could go to the next slide. The last HHS account that they've opened up is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. Now, in the main, SAMHSA provides block grants to states for substance abuse treatment, prevention, and mental health services, behavioral health services. But in this case, if you get a community project here, it would not go through that block grant process. It would go directly to the recipient. I think they have selected this account for participation given the obvious and well-established substance abuse and mental health crisis and how it's really been exacerbated by the pandemic. This again is a programmatic account, so this is not a construction account. They'll let you move a wall or make a little bit of interior space renovation, but this is not. If you want to do construction and equipment, you want to be in the HRSA account. You don't want to be looking here. So that's really it in a nutshell. And Shauna, I'm going to hand it to you to take on the education accounts.
Thanks, Rob. So as Rob stated, I'll be covering elementary and secondary education and then post-secondary education. As my colleagues have stated over the course of the webinar, it's really important for you to present a project that the member can really put their arms around and be able to champion, because it's going to be so competitive regardless of which account your project is coming out of. So as it relates to elementary and secondary education, this particular funding includes instructional services, after-school centers, curricular development, teacher training, acquisition of books and computers, arts education, social and emotional learning activities, full-service community schools, and elementary and early childhood education. And in general, it should really focus on providing early childhood or K through 12 educational services. It can also include early intervention services for infants and toddlers, transition services, and then once again, post-secondary education services. So for instance, just to give you an example, one of my clients does a lot of work with the local school district. They have a tutorial program. So they're looking at putting forth a program where they work directly with the district, the school district, as well as the university. And that's something the member is excited about because it's not only supporting this amazing initiative, but it covers the school district as well as the local university. So oftentimes if you can be creative where you're checking off 2 boxes for the member, that's very helpful, but it's also a very strong program. Eligible grantees are state education agencies, school districts, as I mentioned, colleges and universities, and then other public and private nonprofit entities. Community project funding cannot be used under this particular account for construction or renovation of school buildings, except in the case of minor remodeling required for part of technology upgrades. And then if we move forward to post-secondary education, it's very similar. The funding cannot be used for construction unless it's related to, IT upgrades. It really needs to focus on improving access to or the quality of post-secondary education. Examples you can use for projects to hire and train faculty, establish and improve degree programs, improve teacher preparation programs, develop and improve curricula, upgrade technology and telecommunications, acquire science laboratory equipment, or provide student support, and implement, as I stated as an example, partnerships with school districts and establish research and training centers. And once again, it cannot be used for construction or acquisition of property or to renovate buildings. And this essentially completes our coverage for labor, HHS, education, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon. My name is Laurie Hedinger, and I'll be discussing the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill. Prior to joining Holland and I served in the Senate for a number of years and worked for a member that was on the Senate Appropriations Committee and the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. I was a subcommittee staff director of the EPW subcommittee that oversees Army Corps of Engineers and the Water Resources Development Act. And this legislation, otherwise known as WRDA, authorizes Army Corps of Engineers projects and policy. And the Energy and Water Bill, community project funding is limited to the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation. At this time, there will not be community projects in the Department of Energy account. To be eligible, projects must be authorized, which is usually done by Congress, and the funding request must be reasonable. In other words, it should reflect the funding amount that the Corps or the Bureau can realistically spend in fiscal year 2022. For example, in the past, Corps projects were earmarked for $16 million, but that would not be allowed this year, as previously stated that the earmarks overall would be limited. I encourage you to contact your project manager with the Corps District or Bureau Division before you submit your request. But although I know many of you have already submitted it, so I encourage you also to go ahead and contact them because they can be very helpful in determining your funding request. And Congress, most likely the members and the staff, contact them to check on your project request and to see if it meets their approval. For Army Corps of Engineers, there will be limited money for New Starts projects. And these are studies and construction projects that have not previously received Army Corps funding. And this is typical of the process Congress has done in the past. Usually Congress does not allow many New Starts projects to be funded, for example, in the work plan. Army Corps project requests can be made in the following accounts: investigations, and this is for feasibility studies. And these funding amounts usually range from $100,000 to $3 million. Construction. And there are several programs that are very popular, I know, for local sponsors. However, these two programs will receive limited funding in the Army Corps of Engineers account. The first is the Continuing Authorities Projects account, otherwise known as CAP. And this is an Army Corps program for projects under $10 million. And second is the Environmental Infrastructure account. These are the type of projects where Corps will construct water infrastructure, for example, like sewer upgrades. So keep this in mind as you think about submitting these types of projects. The third account, is Mississippi River tributaries. And these are flood risk management projects along the Mississippi River. And lastly, operations and maintenance. And this is typically port dredging projects. For the Bureau of Reclamation, community project requests will be in the Water and Related Resources account. And these are authorized water and natural resource restoration projects across the 17 Western states. And this concludes the energy and water portion today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan Sennett. I'm a partner here at Holland and Knight. I recently joined the firm from Capitol Hill, where I was the staff director for the House Armed Services Committee. I primarily focus on defense and national security issues, so today I'll be talking about the defense accounts. So the House Appropriations Defense Subcommittee is going to limit community project funding to only research, development, test, and evaluation accounts. And that is for each one of the services, and then also the defense-wide account. Now, in the FY21 appropriations bill, RDT&E was funded overall at around $111 billion. So it is a large pool of funding. But as my colleagues have discussed, a very small portion of this year's RDT&E will be community project funding. So there are several requirements for member submissions under defense accounts, and I'd like to go over just a few of them with you. First one, the recipient must be a state or local government or eligible nonprofit, as folks have said. This likely means that state universities who are partnering with the Department of Defense will be the big winners, I think, in this year. So a common question that comes up is, What about a state, local government or nonprofit that's partnering with a for-profit company, as often happens in research and development? Now, there's no express prohibition on those types of arrangements, but obviously the money actually has to go to the nonprofit or to the state or local entity. The second requirement, no multi-year funding. RDT&E is 2-year funding though, so the funding will only be for FY22, but the project performance period can be up to 2 years. And then the next one, funding for future years and where it will come from. That's a requirement that the member must articulate. Now, we know many research projects are multi-year efforts, going to require several years of funding. And so it's just important to make sure that it is articulated where the remaining funding would come from in future years, so that the committee can assess whether or not it's a viable funding. The next one, evidence of community support. Now, in this context, with regard to RDT&E, it's kind of difficult to determine what is community support. So let's say, for example, we have a public university looking to fund a research project in orthopedic injuries of service members. Should they get letters from the university? That's probably helpful to make sure that everyone understands what the research is and how it will add to the body of scholarly works on this particular subject. Also, the military services or the Department of Defense, whoever they're partnering with, that would be important. And then finally, perhaps military service organizations or veteran service organizations who have a vested interest in seeing this research advanced. So all of the above pretty much is the answer there. Another requirement, must articulate how the research will benefit the Department of Defense. And here again, it's important to demonstrate that there has been coordination with the Department of Defense or the relevant military service, and having a letter from them is so much the better. Now, one of the things I wanted to highlight is the difference between program and community project funding language. So after the ban on earmarks, there was still the opportunity for members to submit programmatic language. And so you'll see an example there for program funding, $1 million above the 22 budget request for RDT&E Army. And there may have been discussions about how that additional $1 million would be used, but it is not specified in the legislation. Now that's different than community project funding, which will be the same $1 million to RDT&E Army, but it will specify for which university and for what purpose. And so if the community project funding language is not, the community project funding project is not adopted, there is still an opportunity for programmatic funding language in the bill. So those are two options that are still available. And then finally, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, got some examples of RDT&E Army earmarks from 2008, and you'll see those are just a few examples. The requirement this year will be that if you have multiple members who are looking to sponsor the same program, the same community project funding, each one must submit a separate application submission. And so it's important to have that. And then once it gets listed, it will be listed under each member as having supported that community project funding project. And that is all for the defense. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Galano, and I've been working on the federal budget and appropriations process for 20 years at Holland and Knight. Before that, I worked in the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm going to cover the Interior and Environment Appropriations Bill today. For background, the Interior Bill contains funding for approximately 35 federal agencies. This includes most of the Department of Interior and agencies such as the Forest Service within the Department of Agriculture. The bill also provides funding for the EPA, arts and cultural agencies, and other entities. For FY22, the Interior Subcommittee will accept project requests in 3 accounts. The federal land acquisition account through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, certain state and private forestry projects within the Forest Service account, and then lastly, the EPA State and Tribal Assistance Grant account, or STAG, as it's affectionately known here in town. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the first 2 accounts because they're very specialized and have unique requirements. For example, you cannot submit a Land and Water Conservation Fund request until after the president's budget comes out. So if you haven't been working on this project in the past year or so, it's unlikely to be included in the appropriations bill. In addition, historically, Congress has only earmarked a handful of projects each year in these 2 accounts. But if you have specific questions on them, I'd be happy to answer them offline. So I'd like to spend most of my time today covering the EPA STAG earmark account, since that account is generally of widest interest across the country, and the vast majority of earmarks in the Interior Bill are STAG earmarks. STAG earmarks fund local wastewater and drinking projects, including construction and modification of sewage treatment plants and drinking water treatment plants. Before we get into FY22, I thought I'd give you some historical background on STAG earmarks, which you might find helpful for context. So congressional appropriators began the practice of supplementing appropriations in the Clean Water Act accounts with earmarks in FY89. At that time, members decided to intervene with earmarks for a specific number of reasons. In some cases, a community may have been unsuccessful in getting state approval for a state program, or in other cases, a small or rural community may have sought an earmark because the cost of financing with a state loan, which must be fully repaid, was deemed unacceptably high. So, beginning in 1989, Congress began to earmark the STAG account. Over the years, the number of earmark projects increased from 4 in FY89 to 320 in FY10, which was the last year for earmarks. And in the bottom right of the slide, you'll see some examples of STAG earmarks from the FY08 bill. As the number of earmarks increased over the years, the average size of STAG earmarks decreased. So from a high of 18 million in FY95 to 5 million in FY99, and finally to just under 600,000 with the average size in FY10. So you can see the trajectory of that program, and we would expect earmarks for FY22 to be under $1 million as well. And that brings us today. Similar to past practice, for FY22, the committee will limit STAG earmarks to only projects that are publicly owned and that are generally eligible for funding from their state's Clean Water or Safe Drinking Water Revolving Fund. Privately owned projects are not eligible for STAG earmarks. There is a minimum 20% non-federal cost share for any portion of an earmark. So for example, a $1 million total project could receive a maximum of $800,000 in STAG earmark, with the remaining $200,000 being the responsibility of the non-federal partner. And in most cases, STAG earmark funds cannot be matched with other federal funds. So in terms of some tips on how to make your FY22 STAG project request more competitive, I would agree with everything my colleagues have said earlier about having strong documented community support through letters of support, local government resolutions, and even news articles describing the challenge that the project seeks to preserve. Some specific STAG tips for this year. The committee will look favorably upon requests for projects that are listed on a state's most recent intended use plan. Projects that have a non-federal share greater than 20% will compete better. Projects that address a compelling need, like removing lead drinking lines, or projects benefiting disadvantaged communities, or projects that have a strong environmental protection component will be particularly attractive. And finally, triple check that your proposed project is physically located in a member's district or benefits that member's district before you submit. As has been stated, members can only submit up to 10 projects total for FY22. So any imperfection in your application will likely result in your project not being advanced to the committee. Thank you for your time today, and that concludes our Interior Appropriations section.
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon. I'm Lisa Barkovic, a Senior Policy Advisor here at Holland and Knight for the past 16 years, working with local governments on public safety issues. And prior to that, I was on the Hill working for a member of Congress from the Florida delegation, and I had the unofficial title as being Director of Appropriations. In fact, that's where I first got to know Mike Galano, because he used to come and lobby me on earmark requests in the early 2000s. There are 4 counts in the Commerce, Justice, Science appropriation bills. I'm going to start to talk about the last 2 that's on this list here, the No Operations, Research and Facilities account, as well as the NASA Safety, Security and Mission Services account. These 2 accounts are very narrow within the CJS bill. And so you're going to be finding in the NASA section, it's focused on STEM education and research. So really the entities that you will be seeing applying for community project funding are universities, nonprofits that are focused on STEM education activities like youth science discovery projects, aviation safety, and advanced composite material research. Under the NOAA account, again, very focused on secondary education applicants, as well as nonprofits. And so you'll see the types of projects that get funded under the NOAA operations account are in regards to height modernization, flood warning systems, and seafloor mapping. That's not to say that state level governments and local governments cannot apply for those. It's just very narrow focused, and not many projects get funded in these 2 accounts. So I'm going to spend the majority of my time talking about the other 2 accounts that are focused on law enforcement and public safety. The first one is the Burn Justice Assistance Grant Program, the JAG Community Project Funding. Everybody should be very familiar with JAG grants because mostly it's an annual occurring formula and competitive grant program as it is. So it supports a broad range of program areas. So law enforcement program, prosecution and court programs, prevention, education, drug treatments, and then a lot of focus these days because of what's going on nationwide with regards to law enforcement is on mental health programs. The way that Burn is going to be set up for this year for FY22 community project funding is that the committee is really focused on following the guidelines of how the statute is currently written. And so that is online. And so if you're looking to see if you're eligible, it is going to be open to state, local, and tribal governments, and then public agencies that serve those local governments like your sheriff's office or your law enforcement program. I might venture to say that you could probably see some schools get awarded funding through this account because that's how it used to, 10 years ago, you used to be able to fund secondary education programs that are focused on crime prevention ideals. So you could see that this time, but right now they're very focused on just sticking to the statutory guidelines. And so the match that is required for Burn JAG is 75% federal and 25% of the local sponsor share. And then the second program that I'll spend a lot of time on is the COPS Technology and Equipment account. This is run through the COPS office, the Community Oriented Policing Services Office. And this account is very flexible for your law enforcement agencies. First, there's no match required. Second thing is there's actually a 24-month performance period. So as you've heard my colleagues mention, most of these projects are requiring 1-year funding. Right now, the COPS is having a 24 month period of performance on that. So you have a lot more flexibility on that. So the types of things that they're going to be focused on funding through this account is, runs the gamut. And so anything that will help community policing, crime prevention, you name it, can be funded. And I'm going to give a couple of examples and ideas of things to think about too with this account, just so you have an idea, because there is that nationwide discussion, and going back to Leslie and Mike's points earlier about the lens that what some of these members' offices are thinking about. And so there is this lens that some members represent areas that are strongly pushing to defund law enforcement, right? And so you have to have that idea in mind, like, where does your member of Congress stand on terms of these nationwide discussions on funding law enforcement? So you could actually make a request to fund for tracking and monitoring progress towards fair and efficient policing goals. That's a suggestion you could do. I know some folks are submitting requests to fund the body-worn camera system. So there is a grant program that funds the actual camera, but actually there's a lot of costs behind the scenes of making those programs run, and data and record management systems, and that are some good requests to make to kind of break through some of that lens and noise that's out there on the defunding law enforcement. And the last thing to kind of think about too, and this is just one of the strategies and ideas that we were thinking about, is if members of Congress are limited to making 10 requests, you could possibly want to have your local law enforcement agency pair up with maybe the sheriff's office or another law enforcement agency, and you could come together and submit one request if you have MOUs in place with those other agencies. So you could make $1 million request to your member of Congress if they represent the different agencies for the same type of equipment, and then your MOUs in place would then allow that like $1 million, $250,000 to go to one agency, $250,000 go to another. So that's just some kind of the creative ideas that we have that we can help you think through as you're thinking about these projects. And this concludes this section on the Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Bill. We'll move on to the Subcommittee on Financial Services, which I'm also your lucky presenter. So next slide, please. There is just one account within the Financial Services bill, and this is in support of small businesses, such as workforce development, counseling, research, construction. It is a fairly popular account. So you can see that there are plenty of cities that apply, but also plenty of workforce development boards. Anything that can be in support of small business centers, business incubation, innovation centers, and really you'll see that not only local governments are eligible, but any of your kind of small business centers that you have within your area or region that could be thinking about such projects to submit. And that concludes this section. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Todd Wooten. I worked on the Senate side for a number of years. I worked for two chairs of the Ag Committee, Senator Blanche Lincoln from Arkansas and also Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan. I will be covering the Agriculture and Rural Development Subcommittee and the earmarks therein. Of note, within this subcommittee, while there are a number of accounts, only 3 of them are actually eligible for community project requests, the 3 you see here. We will start with the Community Facilities Program. Community Facilities Program provides funding for community facilities which are considered essential. What is defined as essential? That's defined as a facility that provides an essential service to the local community for the orderly development of the community in a primarily rural area, and crucially, does not include private, commercial, or business undertakings. What communities are we talking about? This is a theme, obviously, within things with USDA, rural areas. So a rural area is, any city, township, village, including tribal lands, with no more than 20,000 people. There's a couple of things to that. As you can see, there's a specific section in the CFR where you can find a kind of a more specific definition of what is considered rural. What could you do with a grant or a low interest loan under this program. You can use it to purchase, construct, or improve any number of these facilities. Examples might be healthcare facilities such as hospitals, medical clinics, dental clinics, public facilities such as town halls, courthouses, airport hangars, possibly utility services even with telemedicine or distance learning, a pretty broad variety of things, but again, limited to rural areas. The next program is a little bit interesting. This program provides broadband pilot grants. It did not exist back whenever they were last doing earmarks. Reconnect came about during the Obama administration. And so this would be the first time that anyone would actually apply for an earmark under it. This is a broadband pilot program. Again, just trying to bring broadband to, once again, rural areas as we defined them earlier. For those who care, the tech specs for a community which doesn't have sufficient broadband is any community which doesn't have the capability for 90% of the residents to have download speeds of 10 megabytes and upload speeds of one megabyte. These are loans and grants. They, again, go to build the actual infrastructure for broadband, but also for the equipment. Who can apply? This is a little bit interesting for this program. It's not just state and local governments. Because of the limit being put on by the House Appropriations Committee, typically a for-profit entity could actually apply for a grant under this program. Obviously, with the restrictions that they put on, you're not going to be able to do that for one of these community projects. A nonprofit entity could, though. So again, I would encourage, if you kind of do have an interest, to just go and look that up. One thing of note here too, if your program request includes an education facility or a hospital, anything medical, you get a little bit higher consideration. So that is, again, this new program for this year. The final program, ARS, Ag Research Service. It may not be the sexiest program, and as an Arkansan, I do believe there are sexy programs within USDA, but it is arguably the most important program. This is USDA's chief research agency in-house, employs roughly 8,000 people all across the country. These are requests that would build, repair, or improve the various ARS facilities. These are facilities which are associated with land-grant universities. If you're interested in anything along these lines, again, it's important to tie it to a specific research project. And these are a little broader than you might think. To kind of come back to my home state, in Fayetteville, in the northwest corner, at the U of A, you could have a research you could have a research project on poultry. In the center of the state, a little more urban, you might have one that was focused on children, nutrition, things like that. So again, this is research at land-grant universities. It's a very, very big pool. It may not be of interest to a ton of people, but there will definitely be a lot of projects in this area. And that concludes our section on the subcommittee on agriculture and rural development.
Thank you, Todd. My name is David Whitestone, and like some of my colleagues, I was an associate staffer on the House Appropriations Committee in the late 90s, which of course is when the earmark process really began in earnest. Today, I'm going to discuss the community projects in the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill. Next slide, please. Thank you. As you will note from the slide on your screen, the community projects can be pursued through FEMA, one of the agencies in the Department of Homeland Security. And while the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Bill funds lots of different agencies, the opportunities for these community projects are really limited to 3 programs within FEMA, as you will note on the slide. Those programs include the pre-disaster mitigation grants, nonprofit security grants, and the Emergency Operations Center grants. A few things to keep in mind about all 3 of these programs. First, the projects must be eligible under an existing grant program. Second, the entity that actually makes the application to FEMA is going to be your state agency. They will, in effect, act as your agent. And that's relevant because in each of these areas, the state agency is asked by the Appropriations Committee to submit a letter of support, and in some cases, note the eligibility of that project. And finally, eligible grantees are generally governmental entities, with the exception, of course, of certain nonprofits in the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, as we'll discuss a little bit more. As it regards the pre-disaster mitigation grants, this program, you should know, invests in infrastructure, which has a tendency to mitigate risk. There is a preference for nature-based solutions, so keep that in mind to the extent that you're interested in this grant program. And if you are, I would urge you to consult the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities Notice of Funding Availability, or NOFA, which outlines the eligibility requirements in a little bit more detail. With regards to the nonprofit security grants, a few things to keep in mind. As noted, the projects plan and respond to terrorist attacks. Projects must be eligible under the program's NOFA, which I would encourage you again to look at for more detail. And a couple of the factors that we have identified in the NOFA that I wanted to bring to your attention specifically today include the entity should be at some risk, and the program's application, if you will, needs to identify that risk. And second, the program must also identify whether there's any derogatory information about the ultimate grant recipient, so that the committee has 360-degree awareness of the ultimate receiving entity for these grants. With regards to the Emergency Operational Center grants, again, the program must comply with the NOFA that's out there. And in fact, the last NOFA that we could find for this particular grant program goes back to 2011. And if somebody has seen one that's more recent than that, we sure would like to see it too. There is a cost share associated with this program. And as you can imagine from the description of the program by the title, these grants are for emergency operations centers at the state and local level, as well as tribal, with the purpose not only of protecting communities, but integrating plans and practices amongst multi-governmental jurisdictions. The Appropriations Committee has requested that these applications from members of Congress for these funds be submitted by April 30th. And that concludes the DHS section of today's program. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. And before we go to questions, and we'll have time for a few questions here, I just wanted to mention a couple of quick cleanup things. First of all, thank my colleagues for the great job they did. That's the picture in the House. It somewhat begs the question, where's the Senate, Rich? Good question. The Senate is still working through between Senator Leahy and Senator Shelby, the chair and the ranking Republican on the Appropriations Committee, what the Senate earmark process will be. We are hoping and expecting we'll get final decisions from Senator Leahy and Senator Shelby sometime in the next couple of weeks, but they also are waiting for the president's budget to come out. And as we know, the skinny budget we're expecting to see perhaps in the next week or so, but the president's full budget won't be out until early May. So we may not know whether we're going to have earmarks in the Senate for the next 3 or 4 weeks. The scuttlebutt is there's definitely some conflict in the Republican conference on this, and there may not be a majority of votes in favor of earmarks as we sit here today. So nothing's definite on the Senate front yet, at least for Senate Republicans. And obviously we'll keep all of you posted as things move forward. But we would expect if the Senate does move forward that they will largely mimic, if not the limit on requests, at least sort of the general accounts that we're looking at for funding. Some great questions came in during the program, so I appreciate it. First one, are projects that have already broken ground but are underfunded eligible? I'm gonna take that one and sweep it away quickly. The main issue is when you get an earmark, particularly an earmarking one of the construction accounts, it requires that federal cross-cutting requirements, including the Davis-Bacon Act and the National Environmental Policy Act apply, and all federal contracting requirements apply. So if you've broken ground on a project and you haven't used federal contracting requirements, then no, you cannot just add money to your ongoing, non-federal procurement process, because you will be required basically to start the whole procurement process over again. Next question is a good one for I'm actually going to throw this to Dave. If it's not clear from our gray hair, Dave, Rob, and I have been collectively and collaboratively doing this all for too long together. But Dave, the question here was, if we've already conferred with our member of Congress on a potential earmark ask, what are the specific next steps after having that discussion that you would recommend we take?
You're on mute, Dave.
Dave, we don't have sound from you.
Okay, let me see. I got it turned on now. Yeah, thank you for that question, by the way. I think it's a really good one because it mechanically, there are a few steps that are necessary to go through to ensure that the program from its infancy ends up with receiving the federal investment. The first thing that I would do is make sure that the program or the grant or the application actually is eligible under the program guidelines. And there are a number of different resources that you can turn to for that. And as some of my colleagues have said, some of that's in federal notice of federal funding availabilities. The other thing that I would do too is make sure that the community support is well organized, and that any state agencies that are necessary participants in the program are not only aware but made supportive of this. And that takes a little bit of time, honestly. And the third thing that I would identify before I turn it over to my colleagues is, to the extent practical, I would certainly try to brief the professional staff on the Appropriations Committee in both the House and the Senate so that they have situational knowledge of the program and of the project and the degree to which it has an impact in the community, and it satisfies all of the things that the federal government is looking for when it spends funds in a particular community.
Thanks, Dave. I'm going to throw this one to Rob Bradner. Rob, the question was asked, if a member has to stay within 10 projects total, is there a dollar max that he can request for an individual project, or the total number of projects requested?
There is no specific limitation. What they are talking about is spending not more than 1% of the discretionary budget on these projects, which would translate into about $7.5 billion for the House, if that was half of that total. If you do the math, which is to divide 10 projects per member, you would come out with $1.7 million. But we're getting a lot of feedback that they're not gonna necessarily go that high. I think my own opinion is, for some of the social services and health construction and things, that you're probably on good ground in the 1 million to 2 million range, but that's not a it's not a firm rule. I would say on this subject that you always want to make sure you have something that's scalable, because if you go in and ask for $10 million, they're going to ask, well, what if I only get you 2? Can you use it? And if the answer is no, then you're not going to get funded. So always be thinking about, like with a construction project, could you do a piece of it? Could you do the architecture? Could you do the design? Could you do the equipment? How could it be scaled to make it more attractive?
Thanks, Rob. Shauna, the question came up, if you are a regional nonprofit that is part of a national nonprofit, are you better off dealing with your regional members of Congress and just going to get an earmark for your region, or stronger coming at it from the perspective of working collaboratively with the national office and getting an earmark for the entire nonprofit?
That's a very good question. Unfortunately, my video is not coming on for some reason, so I'll have to just use audio. I really think it depends on the nonprofit and how strong the relationships are. If your relationships are stronger on the national, where you're headquartered, then I would suggest you move in that direction. If you have a chapter that has really strong relationships within and community relationships within that district, then you can move forward in that way as well. I don't think it hurts to do both, but you really need to weigh where your strongest champions are and your community support is to get considered because it's so competitive.
Thanks, Shauna. And last but not least, Mike Friedberg. If you are making a transportation project funding request, are you okay to request funding for both planning and design and construction activities in one earmark? Or how would you structure that?
Yeah, I think you can, but it really depends on the amount, right? Like if it's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, it's most bang for the buck to spread out those eligibility, those eligible expenses, or would you rather have it cleaner with, you know, say the planning or the construction? So technically yes, but it might not be feasible given the amount.
All right. Thanks very much. I appreciate everybody joining us today. That completes our question and answer portion of the program. This has been your Holland and Knight Federal Appropriations team going through background on community project funding for fiscal year 2021, fiscal year 2022.